People need to know what Thanksgiving means in this neighborhood.
The words, sharp and laced with a cold authority, cut through the warm air of the Harrison home. Officer Nolan didn't knock. He pounded on the door, his fist striking the oak as if it were an adversary. When Marcus Harrison, 58, opened it, holding a basting brush still dripping with turkey drippings, he was met not with a polite inquiry, but with a wall of judgment. Nolan, a man whose uniform seemed 2 sizes too tight for his self-importance, didn't look at Marcus. He looked through him. His eyes scanned the pristine entryway, catching the glint of family photos and the sound of laughter, and his lip curled. "We're getting calls about a disturbance," Nolan announced, his voice loud enough for the entire house to hear. "A too noisy gathering. People are concerned." This was the reason. It wasn't the noise, which was barely audible from the street. It was the perception. In Nolan's limited but experienced view, a black family celebrating in this affluent Virginia neighborhood was in itself a disturbance. Marcus, the picture of a suburban father, attempted diplomacy. "Officer, I'm afraid I don't understand. A disturbance? It's Thanksgiving. My family—" Nolan cut him off, a disrespectful, sharp gesture. "I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm interested in the complaint." He shifted his weight, hand resting casually on his belt near his sidearm, a classic intimidation tactic. He leaned in, lowering his voice to an insulting whisper. "Look, Dad, I don't know what kind of parties you're used to, but this is Alexandria, not wherever you're from. People here expect peace and quiet on a holiday." The prejudice was naked. He had already tried, judged, and convicted them of being other. The rookie, Russo, standing behind, shuffled his feet, his eyes darting from Marcus's kind face to Nolan's aggressive stance, his discomfort palpable. Nolan, enjoying his power, looked past Marcus. "Now, are you going to invite me in to discuss this, or am I going to have to come back with a different set of papers?" The threat, a blatant abuse of power, hung in the air. But this very officer, blinded by prejudice, was about to interrupt the one Thanksgiving meal he should have walked away from. And in doing so, he had no idea he was about to threaten a household of off-duty DEA agents. Eliza Harrison, alerted by the sudden silence that had replaced the laughter, appeared at Marcus's side. She was elegant, wearing pearls with her apron, the very picture of grace. "Marcus, is everything all right?" Nolan's eyes flicked to her, his smirk deepening. He seemed to relish having a new person to intimidate. "Ma'am, we're here about a noise complaint. From your neighbor." He gestured vaguely with his thumb across the street. "Mrs. Gable." He invoked the name like a trump card, a secret weapon. "Now, Mrs. Gable has lived here for 40 years. She's the pillar of this community. When she calls and says she's worried about a suspicious group," he let the implication sink in, heavy and foul. He was not just enforcing a noise ordinance. He was acting as the armed agent of the neighborhood's established white picket fence anxiety. Eliza, a university historian, bristled, her intellect offended as much as her race. "Worried? Suspicious? Officer, my son and his wife are here for dinner. That is the extent of the group." Nolan shook his head, adopting a tone of false, condescending patience, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Ma'am, I'm sure it looks that way to you. But the complaint also mentioned a strong chemical smell." This was a new, dangerous escalation. The lie hung in the air, a phantom accusation. He was no longer implying they were loud. He was implying they were criminals, cooking meth or smoking PCP on Thanksgiving Day. The air, which was rich with the scent of sage and roasting poultry, was suddenly poisoned by his fabrication. Marcus's demeanor changed instantly. The calm, accommodating father faded, and a flicker of the DEA agent, a man who knew what chemical smells were, surfaced. "A chemical smell?" Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously flat. Nolan nodded, sensing he'd hit a nerve and mistaking it for fear. "That's right. So I'm going to need to come in. Take a look around. You can consent, or I can get a warrant based on the complaint. Your choice." He was manufacturing probable cause out of thin air, a blatant, terrifying abuse of the power vested in his badge. Marcus stood firm, his body a quiet, unmovable barrier in his own doorway. "Officer, you are not entering my home without a warrant. There is no chemical smell, and you and I both know it. You are acting on false pretenses." This calm legal refusal infuriated Nolan. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already dismissed. He saw Marcus's composure as defiance, not as a citizen exercising his constitutional rights. It was then that a new voice joined the confrontation. "What's going on, Dad?" David Harrison, 30, and his wife, Sarah, 29, appeared in the entryway. David, fit and sharp, possessed none of his father's practiced analytical patience. He took in the scene in an instant. His father rigid, his mother visibly upset, and a cop standing in the doorway like an occupying force. "This officer harassing you?" David asked, his voice low and protective. Nolan's eyes lit up. This was a target he understood. He immediately shifted his aggressive attention from the old man, Marcus, to what he perceived as the young threat, David. The stereotype was so easy for him to access. An agitated, young, black male. Nolan to David. "And who are you? You look agitated, son. You the source of the noise." David took a step forward, placing himself beside his father. "I'm his son, and you're on our property, insulting my mother." Marcus put a hand on David's arm. "David, stay back. This is fine." But Nolan had his new angle. Nolan to Marcus. "You need to control your boy. This is exactly what Mrs. Gable was worried about. Hostility." He pointed a finger at David, a severe accusatory gesture. "I'm starting to think this isn't just a party. I'm starting to think this is a public safety issue." Nolan then placed his boot on the threshold, a clear physical act of escalation, preventing Marcus from closing the door. "I'm not asking anymore. I'm coming in." Marcus placed his hand flat on the door, stopping its movement, the wood pressing against Nolan's boot. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it, letting every ounce of his retired authority seep into the words. "Officer, I'm going to give you one chance. Take your foot out of my door and go back to your car." The moment Officer Nolan pushed past Marcus Harrison, the scent of roasting turkey was replaced by the acrid smell of power being abused, and the sacred family home became a hostile territory. Nolan shoved the heavy oak door open, the force of it sending Marcus stumbling back a step. "That's obstruction, old man. I'm in now." He stepped onto the hardwood floor of the entryway, his heavy, muddy boots tracking dirt onto Eliza's clean antique rug. It was a small act, but it was a profound violation, a deliberate marking of territory. "Nolan, don't!" Officer Russo, the rookie, blurted out from the porch, his voice cracking with panic. "Sir, we don't have a warrant. This is a bad search. We can't do this." Nolan spun on him, his face a mask of fury, not at the family but at the insubordination of his partner. "Are you my training officer, Russo? Or am I yours? Shut your mouth and watch that door. I will handle this." Russo flinched as if he'd been struck. He said no more, but he remained rooted at the threshold, a pale, shamed statue, his hat in his hands, refusing to follow Nolan deeper into the home. Nolan turned back to the family, his power trip restored. He sniffed the air with an exaggerated theatrical gesture. "Yep, I smell it," he lied, his voice dripping with false confidence. "Definitely something not right." He was smelling the rich, savory notes of cinnamon, sage, and pumpkin pie, but he was committed to his fabrication. He swaggered past the dining room table, which was set for a feast. His eyes, small and suspicious, lingered on the heavy, real silver servingware, the crystal glasses, and the family china, Eliza's grandmother's priceless hand-painted porcelain. "Fancy," he muttered, the same word he'd used for the house, but now it was laced with a deeper suspicion, as if a black family couldn't possibly afford such things legally. Eliza, her voice shaking with a cold, precise rage, stepped forward. "Officer, my grandmother served President Johnson on those plates. You are trespassing in my home and insulting my heritage. I want your badge number. Now." Nolan completely ignored Eliza, as if she hadn't spoken. Her request for his badge number was just noise. His focus had found its preferred target, David, who was standing protectively in front of his wife, Sarah. To Nolan, David fit the profile perfectly. Young, fit, black, and defiant. He was the threat Nolan had been expecting. Nolan to David, "You, the son, you live here?" David's jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with anything?" Nolan smirked, taking David's question as confirmation. "It has everything to do with it. I'm running plates on the cars out front. Bet one of them is yours. Got any priors, son? You look the type." The insult was pure, unfiltered profiling. A decorated federal agent was being asked if he had priors in his own father's living room. Sarah, standing behind David, saw the shift in Nolan. She saw him zero in on her husband. Her hand, unseen by the officers, discreetly moved to the phone in her apron pocket. She didn't raise it like a weapon. She carefully placed it on the dining room buffet, screen down, and tapped the screen twice, activating the audio recorder. David, his voice dangerously low. "The type? What type is that, officer?" Nolan chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "You know, the type with the short fuse. The type that's always got something to prove." He walked closer to David, deliberately invading his personal space, a tactic designed to provoke a reaction. "What's your name, smart guy?" David didn't flinch, but he didn't answer. "I'm not legally required to give it to you." Nolan, "In your own home, maybe. But you're interfering with an investigation. That gives me grounds." "Now what's the name?" Marcus stepped in, putting a hand on David's shoulder, a silent message. "Let me handle this. His name is David Harrison. He is my son, and you are harassing him." Nolan saw his opening and seized it. The fact that David had been hesitant to give his name was all the justification he needed. "David Harrison, got it." He pulled out his shoulder-mounted radio mic, his thumb pressing the button with a loud click. "Dispatch, this is 2B12. His voice changed, becoming official, performative, for the sake of the recording. "I'm inside the residence on Elm Street. I have a David Harrison here." He paused, thinking fast, fabricating a narrative on the fly, matching the description of a suspect involved in an altercation at the 7-Eleven on Route 1 earlier. It was a complete, terrifying fabrication, a lie so blatant it sucked the air out of the room. Officer Russo, still frozen by the door, visibly winced. His partner was not just crossing a line, he was inventing a crime. Sarah's breathing hitched, but she remained silent, her phone on the buffet, silently capturing every word. David, exploding. "What? That's insane. I've been here all day. I'm cooking a turkey." Nolan smiled. The outburst was exactly what he wanted. Nolan, "That's what they all say, son. Now I have probable cause to detain you for questioning." He began to unclip his handcuffs from his belt, the metal making a series of ominous clicks. Eliza, in horror, "You are lying. You are inventing a crime. Marcus, call the chief. Call him now." Marcus, his voice rising for the first time. "That's enough, Nolan. You've gone too far." Nolan just laughed, enjoying the chaos he had created. "You think I'm scared of you calling the chief? I am the law here. And your boy, he's coming with me." He holstered his radio mic and lunged for David, grabbing his arm. "You're detained. Put your hands behind your back." But David, a trained DEA agent, reacted on pure instinct. He didn't strike. He used a defensive maneuver, a simple, fluid break grip technique, twisting his arm free from Nolan's grasp. David, through gritted teeth, "Don't touch me." Nolan, enraged at being resisted and worse, outmaneuvered, lost what little control he had left. He fumbled not for his handcuffs, but for his taser. Nolan, "That's it. Resisting arrest." The bright red dot of the taser painted a target on David Harrison's chest, but the real target was the family's dignity. In this room, filled with the legacy of generations, Officer Nolan was about to break more than just the law. He was about to break the sacred heirlooms of a family he had already judged as worthless. "Nolan, no!" Officer Russo screamed, finally breaking his terrified paralysis. He lunged forward from the doorway, grabbing Nolan's taser arm with both hands. "For God's sake, it's Thanksgiving. He's not armed. You can't tase him." Russo's intervention was a desperate plea, not just for David, but for the sanctity of their profession. Nolan, furious at the betrayal from his own partner, turned his rage on the rookie. "Get off me, Russo! You're obstructing!" He shoved Russo violently. The rookie, caught off balance, stumbled backward and tripped over the edge of the expensive rug Eliza's mother had bought, crashing hard onto the floor. This brief, violent diversion was all David needed. He didn't attack. He didn't lunge. He simply moved, placing his body squarely between the out-of-control officer and his mother. But for Nolan, this defensive movement was the final straw, the ultimate act of defiance. "You think you're a tough guy, huh?" he panted, his eyes wild. "Assaulting an officer, resisting." He raised the taser again, his finger tightening on the trigger. He had completely lost his professional composure. He was no longer an officer of the peace. He was just a bully with a weapon, cornered and lashing out. Eliza screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. "No! Don't hurt my son! Please!" "Shut up!" Nolan screamed at Eliza, his voice cracking with rage. He waved the taser wildly, the red dot dancing between David and Marcus. "This is what happens. This is what you get. You people think you can buy a big house in a nice neighborhood and you're suddenly better than everyone." He was unhinged, his prejudice pouring out in a torrent of hate. "You're just animals, all of you." And then he landed on the accusation he had been building towards since he first lied about the chemical smell. "Probably bought all this." He gestured at the beautiful furniture, the silver, the art on the walls, and with drug money. This was the line, the ultimate unforgivable insult. He had voiced his racist assumption. The only way a black family could possess this much was through crime. As he yelled, he shoved David, who was standing his ground. "You're done!" Nolan lunged, trying to grab David's arm again. David, merely trying to keep his balance and not fight back, stumbled sideways. His hips slammed hard into the antique wooden buffet, the one holding Eliza's grandmother's precious porcelain china. The entire cabinet rocked violently. A priceless hand-painted soup tureen, the centerpiece of the set, teetered for one agonizing second. Then it and 3 matching plates crashed to the hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a devastating silence, broken only by the sound of the taser's electric hum. Eliza let out a pained, guttural sob. That china was her last physical link to her grandmother. It was irreplaceable history. Nolan, breathing heavily, looked down at the broken porcelain. Then he looked up at the family's horrified faces. And he laughed. A short, bark-like, arrogant laugh. "Clumsy," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Should have just complied." The laughter died in Nolan's throat. It was snuffed out as if by a sudden lack of oxygen, extinguished by the profound and immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. The air, which had been explosive and hot, turned glacial. Marcus Harrison was no longer looking at his son. He was no longer looking at the taser. He was staring, with an almost academic focus, at the shattered white and gold pieces of porcelain gleaming on his dark hardwood floor. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He looked analytical. He looked like a man assessing damages, calculating the cost of a crime scene. He calmly, deliberately walked past Nolan, who instinctively flinched away, his taser arm lowering slightly in confusion, and stood over the wreckage of the family heirloom. He looked at it for a long, quiet moment, then turned to face the officer. The taser was still in Nolan's hand, but its power, its menace, had evaporated, replaced by a sudden, confusing silence. "Officer Nolan," Marcus began. His voice was quiet, precise, and terrifyingly cold. It was the voice of a man dictating an official report, not the voice of a victim in his own home. "You have just committed felony destruction of property. Given its provenance as an antique, that china is valued at well over $5,000. He wasn't finished. He turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the rookie, Russo, who was now painfully pushing himself up off the floor, his face a mask of shame and disbelief. "Officer Russo, you are a material witness to this act. You are also a victim of his assault, as he physically shoved you to the ground." He turned his gaze back to Nolan. The officer's face, moments ago red and contorted with rage, was now beginning to pale. The adrenaline high was fading fast, In this cold, specific, legal language was a bucket of ice water, cutting through his rage and planting the first terrible seeds of real, professional fear. "You are a witness," Marcus continued, his voice methodically, rhythmically, listing the charges as if reading from a statute, "to Officer Nolan's fabrication of evidence, specifically the chemical smell he invented to justify his entry." Nolan's mouth opened, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. "You are a witness," Marcus pressed on, "to his warrantless entry into a private residence, despite being explicitly told multiple times to leave." Marcus took a small step closer. Nolan reflexively took a small step back. The power dynamic had inverted, and everyone in the room felt it. "And you are a witness to his unprovoked, aggravated assault on my son, David Harrison." "What? What did you say?" Nolan finally stammered. The legal terms were like bullets he couldn't dodge. This wasn't the script he knew. He was supposed to be in charge. He was supposed to be dealing with animals and drug dealers, not a man who sounded like a prosecuting attorney in his own living room. Marcus reached slowly, deliberately into his back pocket. This was a movement Nolan's panic training understood. He raised the taser again, his hands shaking so violently the red dot quivered like a nervous insect on Marcus's chest. "I'm the one in charge here, old man," Nolan yelled, his voice cracking, desperate to reclaim his dominance. "Now get your hands where I can see them. Get your hands up!" Marcus Harrison ignored the taser completely. He pulled out his simple, worn leather wallet. "I am not putting my hands up," Marcus said, his voice flat, "but you are about to wish you never got out of your car." "What's in the wallet, old man? Your AARP card?" Officer Nolan sneered, the taser still aimed at Marcus, his voice a desperate attempt to regain control. But the object Marcus Harrison revealed wasn't a membership card. It was a gleaming gold badge that held the full authority of the United States Department of Justice, and in that instant, the entire power dynamic of the universe shifted. Marcus ignored the taser pointed at his chest. He calmly flipped open the simple, worn black leather wallet. Inside, perfectly recessed in a custom cutout, was the unmistakable, eagle-topped gold badge of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Next to it, laminated and official, was his credential ID. "Harrison Marcus," Marcus stated, his voice as cold and hard as the badge itself. "Supervisory Special Agent, retired. Badge number 66 Delta." He held it up just inches from Nolan's face. Nolan's eyes widened, his brain visibly struggling to process the information. He lowered the taser, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "No," he stammered, his voice dropping to a whisper. That's a fake." It was pure, pathetic denial. "You bought that online. You're impersonating a federal—" Before he could finish the accusation, David Harrison reached into his own pocket. He pulled out an identical, though newer, wallet. "Special Agent David Harrison active. Badge number 2 Mine Bravo," David said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. And then Sarah, from her position by the buffet, held up her credentials. "Intelligence Analyst Sarah Harrison, DEA Domestic Division." It wasn't one agent. It was a family of them. Nolan stumbled back, his legs weak. The accusation he had built his entire confrontation on, the racist, vile assumption that this family must be drug dealers to afford their home, imploded in a spectacular, career-ending fireball. They weren't selling drugs. They were the highest level of federal law enforcement dedicated to stopping them. The irony was so profound, so absolute, it was crushing. Nolan stumbled back, his mind a roaring void, unable to process the magnitude of his error. He looked wildly at his partner, a drowning man searching for anything to grab onto. Russo, there. Russo, who had been frozen by the door, his face a mask of shame, finally acted. He didn't move toward the Harrisons. He moved toward Nolan. "Sir!" Russo's voice was a cracked, terrified whisper. "Officer Nolan, put the taser down." He wasn't asking. He was begging. "Sir, put it down now." Russo, the rookie, the one Nolan had bullied and dismissed, recognized the federal credentials instantly. He understood the chain of command. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they were standing in a house full of people who outranked everyone in their entire department, including the chief. Nolan finally mechanically lowered the taser, his fumbling fingers struggling to clip it back to his belt. His face, which had been red with rage, had drained to a sickly, pale white. I didn't know, he whispered. It was the pathetic, universal excuse of the guilty. Eliza, her voice like ice, cut through his whimpering. You didn't know, or you didn't care. You saw a black family and you saw criminals. You didn't want to know. David slowly, deliberately rubbed his wrist where Nolan's fingers had dug in. He took a step toward the collapsing officer. You just put your hands on a federal officer, David said, his voice flat and cold. In his own home, on Thanksgiving. You are done. Marcus Harrison took a step toward Nolan, who flinched and shrank back. The predator had officially become the prey, but Marcus ignored him, dismissing him as a threat. He turned his attention to the rookie, the only one who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Officer Russo, Marcus said, his voice imbued with a command he hadn't used since his retirement. Russo, who was still standing near the door, straightened up as if pulled by strings. Yes, sir? Marcus nodded, his gaze steely. I want you to take out your radio. Russo, terrified but instantly obedient to this new authority, fumbled for his shoulder mic. Yes, sir. I want you to call your shift supervisor and your chief of police, Marcus instructed, his voice slow and deliberate. Tell them Officer Nolan, badge 2B12, has committed warrantless entry, destruction of private property, and aggravated assault on a federal officer. He paused, letting the words land. Plural. Nolan let out a small, strangled gasp, a sound like a man being choked. Please, he whimpered. No. It was a mistake. The call from Gable. Marcus held up a single, powerful hand, and Nolan's voice died in his throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus returned his attention to Russo. Tell Chief Miller. Tell him Supervisor Harrison needs him at this address immediately, and tell him to come alone. Am I clear? The distinction was critical. Not Mr. Harrison. Supervisor Harrison. It was a summons, not a request. Sir. Yes, sir, Russo stammered. Right away, sir. As Russo turned his back to the room to make the most terrifying call of his young career, Nolan's legs gave out. He sank heavily into one of Eliza's antique dining room chairs, his head falling into his hands. The reality of his career-ending, life-altering mistake finally crashing down on him. David, rubbing the red, raw mark on his wrist where Nolan had grabbed him, took a single menacing step toward the whimpering officer. You called us animals, David hissed, his voice low and furious. You called us drug dealers. You broke my grandmother's china. Marcus put a hand on his son's chest, stopping him. No, son, not like this. He isn't worth it. He's just a problem to be solved. He looked at Nolan, his face a mask of cold, profound disappointment. You will sit there, and you will not speak until my guest arrives. The next 10 minutes were the loudest silence Officer Nolan had ever experienced. It was the sound of a Thanksgiving dinner turning into a wake, and he was the guest of honor at his own career's funeral. No one spoke. The Harrison family didn't need to. The case had been made, the verdict delivered. They sat not in their living room, but as a silent tribunal. Marcus sat in his armchair, his hands steepled, the picture of judicial calm. Alessa, David, and Sarah sat on the sofa, a unified front of weary, righteous anger. Officer Russo stood stiffly by the front door, which he had left open, his gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, wishing he could evaporate. And Nolan. Nolan remained in the dining chair, a pariah forced to stare at the cold, uneaten feast on the table. The turkey, which had smelled of triumph hours ago, was now a sad, cold monument to the celebration he had destroyed. The shattered pieces of china on the floor gleamed in the lamplight, a constant, sharp reminder of his irreversible violation. The call to the chief, which Nolan had arrogantly dismissed as an empty threat, had been made. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the executioner. The only sound was the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second hammering another nail into the coffin of his career. Then a car door slammed outside. No lights, no siren, just a heavy, fast-moving vehicle. Heavy footsteps pounded the walkway. Chief Miller appeared in the open doorway, a large man whose face was already red with stress before he even saw the scene. He stopped dead, his gaze taking in everything. The family sitting like judges. Russo, pale and trembling by the door. Nolan, a broken man at the dining table, and the glittering wreckage of porcelain on the floor. His eyes finally landed on Marcus. He didn't say Mr. Harrison. He didn't say sir. He said the one word that confirmed everything. Marcus. The name was a pained groan, heavy with respect and a deep, agonizing dread. My God, what? What did he do? Marcus Harrison didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply gestured with an open palm toward the shattered porcelain, a silent, damning indictment. He did that, Chief, Marcus said, his voice flat. After he accused my family of being drug dealers and physically assaulted my son. Miller visibly winced, as if he'd been physically struck. He looked at Nolan, his eyes previously filled with stress, now hardening into a cold, profound fury that was far more terrifying than Nolan's earlier hot rage. Nolan, stand up, Miller commanded, his voice a low growl. Nolan struggled to his feet, his legs shaking so badly he had to grip the back of the chair. Chief, the call, it was a mistake. Mrs. Gable said, Shut up, Nolan, Miller snapped, cutting him off. Just shut up. Miller turned his full attention back to the family, his expression one of profound apology. Tell me everything. It was Eliza who spoke. She was no longer the victim. She was the historian, the one who deals in facts, delivering a precise chronological testimony. He arrived at 5:15 p.m., she began, her voice steady and clear. Acting on a noise complaint from Mrs. Gable, he then fabricated a chemical smell to gain entry. When refused, he pushed his way in. That's warrantless entry. Miller nodded grimly, knowing every word was a nail in Nolan's coffin. He then targeted our son, fabricating a story about a gas station altercation to detain him. When David resisted the unlawful arrest, your officer drew his taser, accused us of being animals and drug dealers, and then shoved David into my grandmother's buffet, destroying irreplaceable heirlooms. Officer Russo was present for all of it. As if on cue, Sarah, who had been silent, held up her cell phone. And I have the last 20 minutes on audio, Chief, she said, her voice as clear and analytical as her mother-in-law's, including the drug dealer comment and the sound of the china breaking. Chief Miller looked like he was going to be sick. He was a career cop, a man who understood the intricate, dangerous dance between local and federal jurisdictions. He knew with absolute certainty that he was standing in a room with a career-ending, department-gutting lawsuit. Federal assault charges, civil rights violations, illegal search and seizure, the works, all on audio. He turned to Nolan. The fury was gone, replaced by a cold, operational disgust. His voice was dangerously quiet. Nolan, give me your badge. Give me your weapon. Nolan, his face slick with a terrified sweat, just stared at him. Chief, please. Now! Miller roared, the single word echoing in the devastated dining room. Nolan, his hands trembling so badly he could barely unclip them, fumbled with his belt. He clumsily unhooked his service weapon, his fingers slipping, and placed it on the antique buffet next to Sarah's phone. Then he unclipped his badge from its holder, his movements slow, his eyes dead. Miller turned to the rookie. Russo, you're on desk duty, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation. Get in my car. Do not speak to Nolan. Yes, sir. Russo, looking immensely relieved to be given an escape, practically fled the house. The door shut behind him, leaving Miller alone with the family and the disgraced officer. Miller looked at Nolan, who was now just a man in a costume, stripped of all authority. Wait outside on the sidewalk, Miller commanded. Chief, it's cold. Nolan whimpered. On the curb, Nolan, and do not speak to anyone. Utterly humiliated, Nolan, now unarmed and unbadged, walked the longest walk of his life, past the Thanksgiving table, through the front door, and out into the cold November night, to sit on the curb like a common criminal. Miller watched him go before turning back to the Harrisons. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the weight of the entire department on his shoulders. Marcus, Eliza, he's fired. That's not even a question. It's a guarantee. His career is over. We will pay for every cent of damage. He looked at the broken china, then at the family. And what do you want? The Department of Justice, Internal Affairs, you name it, it's yours. What do you want to do? There was a long silence. Marcus looked at the cooling, uneaten turkey on the table. He looked at the broken china. He then looked at his son, David, whose face was still a mask of hard, unyielding anger. It's not about what I want, Chief, Marcus said, his voice heavy. It's about what's right. True justice, the Harrison family knew, wasn't about winning a fight. It was about ensuring the fight never had to happen again. The choice they made that Thanksgiving evening wouldn't just end one man's career, it would change the entire department. Chief Miller sat at their dining table, a man defeated waiting for his sentence. He looked at the family, then at the cold food, his face a picture of weary resignation. Marcus looked at his son, David, who was still bristling. After a long moment, David gave a single, slow, reluctant nod. The family had made its choice. We will not be pressing federal charges against Officer Nolan for assault, Marcus said, his voice quiet in the somber room. Miller looked up, his eyes wide with genuine shock. Marcus, after what he did, after he assaulted your son, after he called you, Chief, David interjected, his voice hard but controlled. Don't misunderstand us, he's a disgrace. But a lawsuit, federal charges, that all happens in a vacuum. It's just lawyers talking to lawyers. It doesn't fix the bias that sent him here in the first place. Eliza nodded, her hands clasped on the table. And it doesn't help Officer Russo, she added, her voice soft but firm. The man who tried to stop him. And it certainly doesn't help Mrs. Gable, who is probably still sitting in her dark house, afraid of her new neighbors. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze locking with the chief's. We don't want Nolan fired, Chief. This time Miller was utterly bewildered. He shook his head as if he'd misheard. You don't? No, Marcus said. Firing him just makes him an angry, unemployed racist with a gun. It doesn't teach him anything. It doesn't protect the next family he sees. Chief Miller was speechless. He was prepared for a lawsuit, for a federal investigation, for calls to the mayor, or even the governor. He was not prepared for this. He was a bureaucrat, a man who understood procedures and settlements. He did not understand this level of complex, constructive justice. Marcus, he stammered, what do you want? Marcus leaned forward. The quiet authority that had silenced Nolan now filled the room, directed not as a threat, but as a directive. Here's what you will do, he said, not a suggestion, but a term of agreement. You will suspend Nolan without pay for 6 months, and for those 6 months, he is to be assigned to mandatory community service. Unarmed, he held up a hand. Not picking up trash on the highway, he will be assigned to the DEA's 360 Strategy Community Outreach Program in Southeast D.C., the one my son runs. David picked up the narrative, his voice sharp and focused. He's going to spend 500 hours in rooms with the very people he called animals. He's going to sit in addiction recovery meetings at the Anacostia Clinic. He's going to help build playgrounds in the neighborhoods he's afraid of. He's not going to talk. He's going to listen. And at the end of those 6 months, he will write a formal, public apology to this family, which we will decide if it's sincere. Marcus then softened his gaze slightly. As for Officer Russo, we want him retrained in de-escalation, but we also want a formal commendation in his file for attempting to intervene. We need more officers like him, not fewer. This was the ultimate underdog victory, not revenge, but forced, profound re-education, delivered not by a court, but by the very family Nolan had tried to destroy. Chief Miller, humbled and visibly moved, stood up. He looked from Marcus to Eliza, then to David. Marcus, Eliza, that is the most professional and, frankly, the most generous disciplinary action I have ever heard of in my 30 years on the force. Marcus stood as well, meeting the chief's eyes. It's not generous, Chief, Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. It's just good policy. It's what you should have been doing all along. Miller nodded, accepting the quiet, professional reprimand. You're right, he said softly. He picked up Nolan's badge and weapon from the buffet. Thank you, Harrison family, and, from the bottom of my heart, I apologize. For everything. He turned and left, leaving the family alone in their quiet, disrupted home. The front door clicked shut, and the silence returned. But this time, it was a heavy, sad silence. They looked at the broken china on the floor, then at the cold, uneaten turkey on the table. The feast, a symbol of their unity and gratitude, was ruined. Eliza sighed, a deep, weary sound. Then she stood up. She walked past the shattered porcelain into her kitchen. She took out a new, simple, everyday plate. With steady hands, she began filling it. A thick slice of turkey, a generous scoop of apple sausage stuffing, a spoonful of green bean casserole, and a large slice of her pumpkin pie. David watched her, confused. Mom, what are you doing? Eliza looked at her son, a small, sad smile on her face as she covered the plate with foil. I'm going to see Mrs. Gable, she said simply. David was astonished. Mom, she's the one who started this. I know, Eliza said, picking up the plate. She's clearly scared. Scared of noise she doesn't understand. Scared of neighbors she's never met. The only way to fix this is to introduce ourselves. The story ends with the final, powerful image. Eliza Harrison, the historian, the matriarch, walking out her front door, across the dark, cold street, a peace offering in her hands to knock on the door of the neighbor who had tried to tear their peace apart. Because the Harrisons knew that true justice wasn't about winning a confrontation, it was about healing a community. And sometimes the most powerful act of authority isn't showing a badge, but sharing a plate. On that Thanksgiving night, prejudice almost destroyed the sanctity of a family. But justice was found, not in Officer Nolan's abuse of power, but in the quiet dignity of the DEA agents he failed to recognize. The Harrison family teaches us that true strength isn't winning a confrontation, but having the grace to educate the one who erred. In the end, the way to heal a neighborhood isn't to build fences, but to bring a plate of food to your neighbor, no matter who they are.